Hello,
Hi,
hello.
how are you?
I'm doing wonderfully. How about you? Why isn't my
Good,
camera
thank
on?
you.
Oh, because I don't have my camera on. There we
Oh.
go. Hold on. Knew there had to be a reason.
There we go.
There we go. Hello.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. Thank you for taking the time.
Of course, very happy to get to meet you as well. Just getting things set up here.
Gotcha.
Okay, so yeah, I really appreciate you reaching out. Do you have any questions before we start?
No, not at all. I think I get the premise.
Okay. um, all right. So I want to start by thanking you for coming on my podcast. Whenever I see someone who disagrees with me publicly, I usually will reach out to them and invite them on, but very few people ever take me up on that. So I'm very happy to get the chance to speak with you. So for people listening, I put out a tweet saying if someone is critical of my work, I invite them to come on my podcast to debate and discuss. And Vaush tweeted, I would be absolutely delighted to come on and discuss your work. So here we are. I know you are a big fan of mine. You posted a video on your YouTube channel titled Transphobe Debunks Herself on the Joe Rogan Experience in response to one of my appearances on Joe's podcast. So, my goal in having you on is to hopefully build some bridges. I do think the culture war is especially polarized right now. And I think, especially on the issue of gender, and I think sometimes a face-to-face conversation can really help to build some understanding. So I thought we'd go through a list of topics that we potentially disagree on. And if you feel I've missed anything, I'll leave some time at the end so you can bring those up.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I have a bit of a hay fever at the moment, unfortunately, because of the spring. I'll try to keep my audio clear, muting if I ever have to clear my throat, just letting you know.
Okay. No worries. I have the same thing. I'm a little bit flushed right now. So if anyone watching is wondering why, that's why. I feel your pain. So, first thing, is gender a social construct?
Yes, absolutely.
And what is your evidence for that?
Well, if we acknowledge that sex and gender are distinct categories, which of course, we invent the words, we can decide their meanings if we choose to, with sex being a biological distinction, highly bimodal, of course, with distributions ranging strongly towards male or female with some intersex people, and gender as a collection of social rules and expectations associated with sex. I think that the social construction becomes clear when we attempt to discretely categorize these distinctions. Very much like race, which is broadly accepted to be a social construct, no one denies that there are biological elements to race. White people have, of course, lighter skin on average than Black people. It's been known to happen. But where we draw those lines, well, do we separate North and South Africans? Is the Mediterranean a distinct racial category? That's a social thing. Likewise, for the longest time, we've decided there are two genders here in the West, social categories distinguished exclusively by sex. But of course, there are other cultures where that's simply not the case. There have been cultures where there are third genders or broader paradigms. India has a legally recognized third gender with more than 1 billion people in that country. I'd say their perspective is worth something. It's not to say it's not informed by biology, only that it's not solely determined by it. There is a social construction there.
Right. So I agree with you in that I don't think gender is entirely biological, but I would say biology plays a larger role than or the socially constructed aspect of it. And I think those of us who argue in favor of biological explanation, sometimes people will take that to mean that we don't think society plays any role at all. And in my case, I definitely say that's not true. My perspective in saying that biology plays a role is it does go back to the prenatal environment. Actually, let me start by saying I do agree with you that sex and gender are different things. I don't think they're necessarily the same. I do think they're linked for most people, but they're not necessarily the same. So obviously, with transgender people, their sex and their gender are not the same. But for the vast majority of us, over 99% of us, that is the case. So I want to clarify that. But in terms of the biological aspect, in terms of what is considered masculine or feminine in society may be socially constructed or socially imposed, but whether someone gravitates to what's considered masculine or feminine is dictated by biology in terms of the prenatal environment and in terms of testosterone exposure, right?
I definitely think there's a truth to that.
Agree with that? Okay.
Certainly. Though what is masculine and feminine, of course, can vary massively culture to culture. Like in imperial China, there was a practice of women binding their feet to make them all small. And, I can understand from a biological perspective how a fetishization of petiteness in women could be a kind of recurring theme throughout different cultures. But suffice to say, I don't think that's a recurring trend we see nowadays, say, for example, in, modern LA, the practice of feet binding, making people look more feminine. I hope not. It was pretty unhealthy back then.
I'm kidding.
Maybe it is, God knows these days. But so, maybe there are the hormone washes that you undergo in vitro, I think affect significantly what your preferences in life are going to be on later. But a lot of that feeds into a sort of cultural preconception of what it means to be a woman or a man, both in a social and in a biological sense. And I think that people feed into that. It turns into a kind of feedback loop where, you go back 1,000 years and people were doing wild stuff to demonstrate their masculinity or their femininity, like they wanted to. It felt like it was like a drive. But nowadays we've no such desire. And I think we construct the categories that we're sort of driven to walk within to an extent, and that's in a sense I think it recurs a little bit.
So when you say that, do you mean maybe society pushes people to veer off to in one direction or the other?
Yeah, I think so. What a masculine man is today, I mean, I don't know, think Vin Diesel. I think many kinds of masculine men, but just think Vin Diesel, right? Vin Diesel as an archetype wasn't around in ancient Greece, but men were, and testosterone was. I think that today there are men with a strong biological predisposition towards achieving something. And when they want that something, they look at media and they say, oh, well, Vin Diesel's a guy I can look at. That's an archetype worth pursuing. That option wasn't available back 2,500 years ago. So maybe there are different avenues. They would look at the legends of Achilles. I'm not a great scholar of the classics, but I think to an extent, and maybe the masculinity, the underlying testosterone, the hormone washes, they drive both of those things. But obviously, we play a huge hand in determining where that road goes.
Right. I do think it's important that people have that ability to choose. I definitely, by arguing for or talking about biological explanations for gender, I'm definitely not saying that men and women should be held to stereotypical roles. So I think you mentioned in your video about how I have a PhD in neuroscience, and that is a male typical discipline. And I'm definitely not saying I think women should be in the kitchen having babies and not being allowed to have a vocation at all. I just think it's important for us to be able to talk about the reasons why there are these sex differences. On average, again, that doesn't say anything about any individual person, because my goal with anything I do in my work as a journalist is to just try to provide people with information and let people decide what they want to do with it. But my concern is when I feel that information is being hidden from people, because I think that can sometimes work against people and in terms of their ability to make informed choices. So your point about, pardon?
Oh no, I was saying, of course. Okay. Since that video that I watched some time ago, I've taken the time to read up on quite a bit more of your work to gain a broader understanding of your perspective. Though, of course, the Joe Rogan appearance is quite a publicity boost. So that was the first time I saw you.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. So your point about race, I'm curious to understand, because I'm sure people in my audience, when they hear race is a social construct, they'll say, what? And so that was initially my first reaction as well. But I'm curious to hear. So when you say, I agree with you in terms of how we differentiate among the races, to some extent that classification is a little bit arbitrary, but are there not some biological correlates, say with medical predisposition differences that do link to biology?
Of course. I think a good example would be sickle cell anemia for West Africans, I believe. There are definitely some dispositions, though a lot of them are more cultural than people might think. For example, the lactose intolerance difference between Western Europeans versus Southeast Asians, I think, can be attributed,
Right.
at least in large part, to the availability of and cultural predisposition to lactose products over the centuries and the gut bacteria we build up. When biologists study what we call colloquially race, they talk about clines, hundreds of discrete uh, genealogical spectrums that range geographically across the globe, and what we talk about when we say race, in a broader sense, really is just determined by skin color and maybe a couple of facial features that people's eyes tend to draw to, because that's what we can see, we can identify. But those are actually really bad markers for genetic differentiation. So if you were really studying in depth how humans are constructed, it's mostly geographic. You take somebody from one part of the world, move them to the other. In a couple hundred years, their children are going to be much more genetically similar to the people of that environment. Just as a product of a ton of factors, related to culture and environment, temperature and what have you. And it's so infinitely complicated. We see so little of it. I feel in a way gender is kind of similar. We have these social constructions, but there are many different types of men, right? I grew up in right next to West Hollywood, which is a thriving gay community. And
Hooray.
right. And when you're near gay communities, you notice there's I wouldn't call it a binary, but there's definitely a strong divide between some of the more masculine and some of the more feminine men, and the whole dating rituals that go along with it. I'm into men, so to a degree of participated in this. And it's not at all difficult to imagine a society in which that could have been categorized as a third gender. You have masculine men or tops or what have you. They're categorized in one direction. Then you have the other, more bottomy feminine men, and people would have been a gender trinary. People would have found ways to get angry about that. But we construct a lot of this stuff. I encourage people to be, I suppose, open-minded. The idea that things could have been different.
Right. And so your point about third gender cultures like in India, the Hijra, in my book, The End of Gender, I talk about the Fa'afafine, which are third gender culture in Samoa. So in terms of, I'm trying to follow how this leads to gender being socially constructed, just basically where we differentiate between what's a man versus someone who's in between male and female versus what's female. Is that what you mean by it's socially, like, the third genders lead to that conclusion to you?
Well, because you could decide to draw these lines anywhere, even if you were to presume that gender has to be something associated with roles constructed by sex, to an extent, or like how people relate socially to their sex. If people relate to their sex in different ways, a la, bottoms and tops in the gay community, you can make a strong argument that these are fundamentally different gender roles. A strong one, socially, the line between gay bottoms and gay tops, I think, is actually a pretty strong and recurring one culturally in a lot of places. In the pre-colonial, I think, Philippines, there was a social role. I think it was accepted as a kind of third gender where more feminine, men or born as males, whatever term you want to use, were sort of socially integrated into the role of women. That's actually, I think, a third gender in a good number of cultures where you have men who take on the role of women. And that's a very broad, thing there, but sort of generally speaking. And we could do that. And to do that, to make that third construction would not in any way invalidate our broader understanding of gender. We would just decide to cut the lines a little differently, much as we have with race. The biological clines, the continuum, has been present in human history, forever. It's our biological diversity, but where we draw those lines, very different in the Roman days than today, and that ultimately is just up to what we care about, what preferences we decide to act on.
Yeah, because I guess I see it as the most simple or the most straightforward way to look at it is just to simply say there are men and there are women. And if there can be deviation within that, but at the end of the day, you're still a man or woman. And if you feel that you identify more so as the opposite, then you are transgender and then transition if that's what you choose as an adult. So I guess my issue is when people, I'm not saying you do this, but when I sense that people are trying to reconceptualize things just for the sake of it. But with regard to third gender cultures, as you're saying with regard to gay men in say with the Hijra or say with the Fa'afafine, they would be considered gay men if we looked at them from, say, a North American perspective. So that's why when people talk about gender being a spectrum, I think, well, I don't think we have to go through and reconceptualize everything in our society just to facilitate acceptance. I think we can say, there are people who are different. There are gay people. There are transgender people. There are intersex people. But for the vast majority of us, 99% of us plus, we are men or women, and we identify as our birth sex. So I see that as the most simple, straightforward way to do it.
Sure, but we shouldn't limit the range of human expression based purely on simplicity. Just because we have a preference towards our gender binary system doesn't mean it's inherently any more valid. I'm fine with social deconstructionism in a variety of ways, so long as it's serving, the idea that it benefits humans, that it makes us happy. And as far as I can tell, both today in the modern world and across a variety of cultures, it wasn't sufficient to simply say, oh, well, this person's a feminine man or what have you, as we construct these categories, as we delineate where we decide to draw these lines, the only real concern, at least to me, is what makes people happy. We're not really talking about hurting people here. When we reconceptualize these ideas, people often talk about this, the destruction of the gender binary. Well, you take non-binary people and I ask, what harm is being done? Certainly nothing that can be measured in a graph. It's this ephemeral, well, what of our traditions? And I don't really care about those. I just care about freedom, really. I'm a libertarian socialist. The idea of people being able to identify how they want to choose their life's path and the terms they use to describe those, as far as I'm concerned, as long as nothing's unscientific, nothing contradicts factual reality, and nothing hurts other people, then it should be fair game. And of course, I don't think anyone's contradicting the underlying the biological nature of things, sex, the gametes, difference between this hormone and that hormone. I think as long as those basic tenets of reality remain consistent, then the identity part, go hog wild. I don't really care where people go with it.
Right. And I agree with you in that I think people should be free to express themselves however they like and be happy and live their life and not be bothered by other people or not be judged. My concern is when people are making these decisions and they are potentially leading, especially young people, to make decisions about modifying their body that may be permanent or may be potentially harmful to them or that they may regret. So with regard to, say, non-binary, and I will use the pronouns someone wants me to use, the same with say, people who are transgender. When I say transgender, I'm referring to people who identify as the opposite sex. And I know that some people might say non-binary is the same as transgender, but I do make that difference. But with regard to non-binary, what is the evidence for this idea that there's a third gender? Are you referring to third gender cultures, or is there additional evidence that you're thinking of?
Well, the evidence for it is simply that there's no greater argument for the system that we have than any culture which has a third gender or had one in the pre-colonial days, which of course was much more common in the pre-colonial days, before our values became homogenized a bit. And this isn't really a scientific or evidentiary thing, really. It's social construction. It's theory, really, gender theory, which people mock, of course. People roll their eyes at it, but there's some really fascinating and complicated stuff behind the wheel there. And I like to use allegories to race because the discourse around racial abolition and the social construction of race hasn't been as politicized as that with regards to gender. If you go back 100 years, the Irish were considered the N-words of Europe, I believe, was a common, derogatory term. Now, of course, they didn't think that Irish people were biologically identical to Northern African people, but there was an understanding that they were somehow lesser within the category of white. The same with Italians, though, to, I believe, a lesser extent. And really, the arguments back then, they attempted to post hoc justify it scientifically, but the arguments back then were fundamentally a social one. What is or is not whiteness? And if you include Irish people, do you include, say, Mediterraneans, Greek people? What about Turkish people? How far south along the Mediterranean? How far clockwise can you go before that becomes a problem? There's no real answer. And to me, being that I'm both a racial and gender abolitionist, my understanding is that given that there are no real answers, there's no real right or wrong, there's only human happiness, we should cast aside categories which do harm and adopt those which minimize it. And this stringent fixation on, well, can you prove this, that, or the other with gender? Well, we can't really prove anything with it. We know there are social roles and categories associated with sex, but those roles and categories change. The lines around them change and have changed historically. I don't know if any factual argument can be made in any direction.
Well, in terms of why there are only two genders, as you mentioned, if sex is determined by gametes and gender identity is determined by biological sex for over 99% of us, then where is the third gamete that would suggest there is a gender in between men and women?
Because it's only determined for 99% of us. Well, first of all, even if it was just the 99%, the existence of 1% constitutes millions of people. But even within that, we constructed the categories to perfectly match sex. So of course, there's going to be a near one-to-one correlation with sex. But if we were to have, say, for example, the masculine and the feminine men being bisected into two categories of men, two genders within what we now consider to be one, well, then all of a sudden it gets more complicated. But you're referring to simplicity in a system which is aestheticized for simplicity. Which I mean, it's sort of a recurring pattern. We've built something to correlate perfectly to sex, so of course it's going to correlate near perfectly to sex. The historical conception of gender and sex is that there is no distinction for the most part, at least in the West. That it's just your roles are because of your sex, and the idea that the roles might be some kind of separate construction is something that, at least for the past few hundred years in Western antiquity, we haven't really engaged with that much.
Well, what do you mean by your roles would be different from your sex if the vast majority of men behave in one way and the vast majority of women behave in another way, and this is driven by biological underpinnings? How is that socially constructed? There's a piece I'm missing here.
Are you of the opinion that color is socially constructed?
Do you mean visual color, or you mean
visual color, the optical perception? Yes.
Socially constructed? As far as I know, it's a biological process.
I agree. It's the wavelengths that we see. Of course, you have people with vision abnormalities which see different colors, right. But we have an understanding of what a properly working eyeball can see, and we have a good understanding of what wavelengths correspond to which subjective experiences of color. But of course, if you take a look at the history of color and language across the world, different cultures have different conceptions of what is or isn't green or blue. There's no hard line, of course, between what a green or a blue is. It's totally arbitrary. It's literally a spectrum. So the line is drawn differently depending on the linguistic preconceptions of the culture that you're looking at. For the most part, we've sort of nailed out the ideas here. But if you take a look historically, like which ideas of color develop first, where are these lines drawn, you get really interesting and very diverse ideas. And of course, this is factual. This is biological. The color wavelength is something that we can measure out and parse mathematically. So it's not like we're exclusively dealing with subjective human experience. And yet, the categories we draw, how many colors are there in the wheel? Are there 5, 8, 10? We say they're functionally infinite, but we only have so many words. And most people separate it into a discrete range of colors associated with the rainbow. At least that's the historical archetype that people draw towards most easily. But that doesn't include all the colors. It doesn't include purple, for example. I guess the point that I'm getting at here is that there's not a contradiction between a biological underpinning and a complete arbitrarity of the overlying concept. It's like the biology is the foundation, but the house you build atop it is very much of your own design.
I can see that to some extent, but with vision, it's still, perception is still to some extent, it's not as subjective to me as how you feel about your gender. So say with gender fluidity for people, my understanding of people who shift between male and female or are both or neither, and this can change throughout the day, that is purely subjective in terms of their self-report of that, right? It's not marked in anything objective, and that's where I have an issue with it, because to me, it just always comes back to what is evidence-based, what's in the data. And when people start straying from that, it makes me wonder, well, why, and what is the purpose of that? And it's fine if people just want to say that's how they feel, but when they start to say that this is what science shows, when it doesn't, that's my concern.
Well, I don't think people speak to science there. people who talk about gender expression are talking about subjective experience, because the social roles are what they're talking about. If people were fussing about with the biology of sex, that's your one thing. But I mean, you can ask people, take 5 people with different shades of blue in their shirts, and you put them in a room, how many color shirts are being worn today? Will you get an answer of 5 distinct for subtle color shades, 1, 2, or will people say that it's all the same shirt color fundamentally? It can even change depending on the time of day. Some people say their eyes are blue when they wake up and green when they fall asleep. A lot of that's a trick of the light, but that's a perceptive thing. And of course, gender, being a construction of social expectation, is itself, to an extent, a perceptive thing. I guess at the end of the day, I think that the fixation with scientific categorization with something as arbitrary as gender will be seen in the long run as obsolete as what we've done with race. Nowadays, biologists speak of clines, the actual underlying genealogical threads, not the overlying categories. And I think that for the most part, biologists are doing the same now with sex, where they're recognizing sex itself, even as a bimodal biological construct determined by a variety of underlying threads. And the gender stuff, I think we should just leave to the purview of social identity. I have as much interest, I think, in the scientific legitimacy of a person being a woman in a gender sense as them being a gamer, or a pothead. You could measure perhaps some genealogical association, but I think it's an identity first and foremost, and should be treated as such.
I think we just have very different ways of wanting to understand phenomena in the world. And so your point about you just made a point there about sex being bimodal. So the thing with sex and gender, I don't consider them to be spectra or to be continua, because most people fall predominantly as one or the other, right? If it were a spectrum or a continuum, people would fall at any point along the way with equal probability. But what you see is most people are male or female. And then you have a small segment of people who say they are in between, or say with intersex people. But intersex we can talk about as well. But in that case, I don't think we should be reconceptualizing society for the sake of a small minority. I think we can advocate for them and equal rights for them without having to reconceptualize everything.
Well, something doesn't have to be equal distribution for it to be a spectrum. It's really just a spectrum of different characteristics. There are sexual characteristics, of course, which vary to the extent that you'll have, males and females overtake each other. Height, for example, being one of those characteristics where the majority of men are taller than the majority of women. There are, of course, overlap, quite a bit of it with regards to that. You have more concrete categories like chromosomes, gametes and what have you. But even then, you have variances sometimes. The intersex category includes a variety of conditions which might lead a person to have anormal representation in those fields. But a binary has 2 options, not 2 with a range in between. And I don't really think that this is of much interest to people outside of, biological experts. I don't think any social reengineering is being done around the idea that sex is complicated. Of course it is. We're biological machines. We're unimaginably complicated. We couldn't build one of us if in a lab, if we wanted to. We need the help of our own genes. One day, God willing. So given all that complexity, the idea that sex would be this very complicated and extremely not spectral, like on a spectrum concept, isn't that alien to me? But I don't think that gets talked about that much. Even with the trans stuff, it's really just a gender thing. Trans women don't go around arguing that they're biologically the same as cis women. If they did, then they wouldn't want to transition. Of course, there's an acknowledgement of an underlying biological distinction.
But so again, I don't think that the most vocal trans activists necessarily speak for everyday transgender people or the average trans woman. But I have seen some activists saying that they are biologically female or they are biologically male because they identify as that sex. And I think that has implications for society more broadly, because especially in the way that this is being taught to kids, I think for some people, they don't realize that sex is real. It's not. I mean, some people will say that sex is socially constructed. And I think if people want to have a conversation about these ideas and tease them apart as we're doing here, that's great. But when it's actually being taught and spoken about like it's true, there are going to be negative implications of that because it's not true.
I can't speak to every trans activist out there, but having been a radical lefty for some time, the only time I can ever remember a person sincerely arguing there's no real such thing as a sex difference, no difference between men and women, trans, cis women, whatever. There's some Reddit thread where they were getting dogpiled by the comments. I don't know if it's something held seriously, a position held by many. I can't argue anecdotes with you, of course, but the idea that the trans community or even the trans activists are of that position, I think, is highly overstated, or a conflation often held and enforced by conservatives, because trans women will go, well, trans women are women, and conservatives will go, well, how can you be a woman if you have no womb? Which is itself a conflation of the gender sex divide right there. Trans women aren't saying they have a womb. They don't, to my knowledge, maybe somehow some of them do. But
I've seen some, but I won't hold you to that. Yeah.
Right. The vast majority don't, I imagine. The conservatives play that game whereby performatively denying the distinction between gender and sex, they can pretend that trans people are just woefully unaware, delusional, that they somehow seem to believe they're biologically the same as, the cis counterpart. But I just don't think that's the case. I think that for the most part, especially these days, trans people are increasingly comfortable with the biological reality of things, the fact that they're not the same as a cis man or a cis woman in terms of where they'll be even after a medical transition. And I think that's a wonderful thing, of course. I don't think that a woman just has to have a womb or what have you. Whatever range of biological accoutrement people decide they're happy with, I think is a wonderful thing.
I think that's great if that's the case, but I wonder then why is it we don't see more of those voices more prominently?
I think we do. Honestly, the only place I see other voices are when they're being signal boosted in conservative discourse. I know that the position that gender is something which is a product of identity, but sex is largely binary and discrete, separate category, is held, for instance, by basically every medical association in the West. That in terms of the broader activism, I mean, I can't speak to every college professor on TikTok, but that is definitely the recurring theme here. People who disagree, not to speak this of you or whatever, but broadly, I mean, I would wonder where they're getting their information from, because the only place I see otherwise really is these conservative spaces where they're incentivized to elevate the voices they think are worst representatives of their opposition.
Can you say that last point again in terms of what you feel medical associations generally put out as their messaging? Obviously not every single one, but just as a broad theme.
But for the most part, it seems like the sort of the recognition of the validity of trans people. I know the APA, the American Medical Association, of American Academy of Pediatrics. I'm sure there's a big list out there somewhere, but that broadly they affirm the validity of trans people, the idea that gender is something that can be identified with and changed. But I don't believe any of these organizations, the American, I don't think any of them verify the idea that that sex can just be instantly changed or flipped over, that there's no discrete differences between men and women who are cisgender or transgender. Certainly transitioning changes some sex categories. I mean, you can only inhale so much estrogen before some sexual categorizations your body adheres to begin to change. But I just don't think that's very common messaging.
So how would you define what is a woman?
I would say that woman is sort of a social archetype that people choose to adopt, like a kind of like an identifier that they want to be known by. Now, obviously, there's a lot of conflation here because people get assigned this, that, the other at birth, which means that you sort of grow up with a set of roles and definitions before you're old enough to have any opinion on the subject, really. But at least when we're talking about, gender as an identity, what people care about when they're older, that's what I think of. It's like being a woman. What does it mean to be a woman? It's how you think of yourself and how you want the world to think of you. It's a sandwich board slung around your neck with a set of identifiers that you want to be considered by. I think people do this with a lot of things, not just gender, but I think gender is sort of the big one.
So when self-identification, are there any areas in which you think biology should play more of a role than self-identification?
Well, if you're talking with your doctor about your propensity for given conditions, obviously I think trans people should be upfront with their doctors about the fact that they're trans. Um, Outside of that, I just, in terms of people's decision making, I don't think biology plays that much of a role insofar as it supersedes people's right to choose for themselves. Obviously biology plays a huge role in a ton of stuff that we do day to day, but if you make the choice to act against the sort of stereotypical categorization down that role, then I think that's fine. I don't really think it hurts anyone to do that.
So what about, where should we start? Maybe sports. Do you think with sports there should be any importance placed on biology or biological differences?
Sure. Well, there already has been, of course. We separate men and women. Women in the Olympics have that testosterone cap they're not allowed to exceed, which is an interesting can of worms right there. The trans sports thing is complicated. There's varying evidence here. Obviously, if you take estrogen for long enough, it destroys your muscles. I mean, God, if you've ever seen a trans woman or like arm wrestled one, you destroy them. You can tear them apart. They're taking bone weakening juice. It's incredible. So, take a few years of that. Nobody's going to be performing as well. There are some products of higher androgen sensitivity prior to transition, which carry over post transition. I think bone density is a big one. Wingspan and height are averages that don't cleanly, recede back to the average for females. Stuff like that. It's a complicated question in terms of what harm is done. Right now, the available existing harm of trans women participating in women's sports is effectively nil. We've heard a couple of headlines over the past 5 or 6 years, but it's usually like some college athlete does slightly better than expected. Sometimes the trans athlete doesn't even do that well, but people get angry anyway. A couple of times things have, they've done better than expected, but it's a very minor problem. It's something that I would really rather have depoliticized and focused on by sports scientists, sports medicinal practitioners, because I think they're best qualified to make decisions on the subject. People talk about it like it's some kind of human rights issue, but it was like Utah passed that law. I think it was Utah, but there's like one trans athlete in all of Utah or something like that. So they passed a whole statewide bill, to curtail a problem which essentially doesn't exist. People just get hysterical over this stuff, I think.
I agree that I think I'm probably more concerned about this issue than you, as I've been quite vocal about it. I'm trying to think of the best place to start. Well, okay, with your point about arm wrestling and muscle mass, I don't doubt that there's an effect of taking estrogen, but there has been research to show that even after a year, 2 years of being on estrogen, that it doesn't change muscle mass or muscle strength. So this is probably not the case for every single trans woman, but I think that's a really important consideration to make, especially if they are going to be competing against women who are born women. And to your point about how this is a very rare phenomenon, I see it growing. I mean, yeah, I do think that there is a lot of attention placed on when we do see this happening, when there are cases, the media really gets on it. But I also worry about the future of women's sports because even in some sports, elite female athletes do not stand a chance against a non-elite male athlete. And there are these differences that are not overridden by taking estrogen or suppressing testosterone in terms of, it goes beyond muscle. It's in terms of foundation, like bone length, in terms of the angles at which bones connect in the body. Women have a higher propensity for injury as a result of having wider hips. In terms of lung size and heart size. So I'm all in favor. I think if it's not in elite sports, I don't have as much of an issue if trans women want to compete in the women's category, because I do think I can imagine that sense of belonging and acceptance is important. But at the elite level, when it can be life-changing for someone to win the competition, especially for these girls who've been training forever for these scholarships. I don't think it's fair, and I also don't think it's fair that they can't speak up without being called hateful. Another question actually I have for you is,
I'd like to speak on that if I may.
okay, go ahead.
Every study I've seen indicated that medical transition weakens the musculature significantly. So I would have to, and I've seen a good bit of research on that. So I'd have to see your source there. I guess the issue that I have with this ultimately is that this is an example of a politicization of a problem gone like mad, you know, like so far we have maybe a handful, like an actual 5 or less count of cases where there's been some kind of upset as a product of trans women and women's sports over the course of this being a cultural issue over the past 6 years. When we're operating with this number, I mean, this is like national outrage over like rare diseases that don't have a name yet. This is such a marginal issue. Now, that's not to say, mind you, that it's not worth consideration or discussion, but we're talking about an issue which has merited a national response. And to be fair, and you know, to clear aside, and again, not saying this about you, but 98% of this discourse really has nothing to do with women's sports, because most of it's fronted by conservatives. Conservatives don't care about women's sports. They have never cared about women's sports. It has been a long running joke that they don't care about women's sports. They have admitted they don't care. Like, it's just been a chauvinistic, you know, condescending derision for decades and decades. It's about trans people. And this is an issue which is very medically oriented, something that should be left to the science, I feel. But the discourse happening right now has nothing to do with the science. It's this weaponization of a marginal issue in order to direct an attack against a broader community. And you see this play out all the time, you know. In terms of like problems affecting American people, this is so unfathomably far down any list a person could arrive at. I don't mean to say this to diminish the concerns that female athletes might have, you know, only to say that the national response, I mean, making this one of the top billing, you know, issues for the Republican Party, I think it demonstrates an incredible bias with regards to what issues should be focused on. I mean, there are more cases of Republican legislators being fired for sexual misconduct in the past couple of years than there have been of these trans female athlete upsets combined over the entirety of the time it's been discussed. Where we focus our attention is itself a political decision, one which warrants justification, I think, especially when it's this disproportionate.
Well, I would argue this isn't a conservative or Republican issue, because there are definitely Democrats who are concerned as well. And this is, I interviewed Kara Dansky about this for my podcast, and people can go listen to that. And she said this is going to be the issue that brings the parties together, because this is not something, it's not a left or right issue, nor do I think it should be. Your point about how there are only 5 cases, there have definitely been more than 5. I mean, I could count them right now.
Of upsets? Because normally it's just a trans woman being in sports that people get upset over. But in terms of the overperformance, I think generally they perform well within the lines of expected cis female performance.
Well,
it's definitely
they win though. Thing. They win by quite a margin, do they not?
The number of times that trans women have won by quite a margin in sort of college athletics or above is, no, for the most part, usually this upset happens before they've won anything. Usually it's just them participating at all. I remember there was that I think they were track and field. And they did a whole documentary, and the trans woman, wasn't she came in like 6th or something. The woman who was mad came in 8th or 9th, and it was the top 8 who were qualifying, and she was mad over that, something like that. It's like, again, if you were to take a look at any other issue, if this is what unites the parties, then America deserves to burn. We have infrastructural issues, you know, we can't feed or clothe our people. Our healthcare system is broken. If our parties are united, not over any real issue that affects like the American people, but issues so marginal that you can count on one hand the number of trans athletes per state, I think that's really indicative of how much of a divide there is between like the cynical political messaging that's used in Washington and what Americans actually need to get by day to day. It's just, I can't summon that much, because I can just think of any other, like, you know, do the people who claim to care about, you know, college women's sports? Do they care about like college athletes being exploited, not being paid for their work, while the colleges make millions of dollars off of the broadcasting rights to those games? Because that happens to tens of thousands of people every year. No, of course not. It's the trans athlete thing, and we get this one big story every 6 months.
Can we go to that Connecticut track? So one of the trans girls actually did win first place in the 102-meter dashes.
In the initial, one of the are we thinking of the same one?
Yeah, I don't want to say her name just because I don't want people to bully this person. I generally I don't want people to go after the individual athlete. To me, this is more about the larger trend of what we see happening, right?
Well, in terms of, there were two. Okay, we might be talking about different ones. I mean, a trend on a national scale would just require more data points. Again, like the harm we're talking about here is like maybe a couple of cis women have placed. This is
winning.
I'm sorry. The idea that you can justify national outrage based on a handful of cisgender women in college placing lower than they might have otherwise is insane to me. Every other problem imaginable is more worth national consideration. If this was just being discussed in academia or like sports science or whatever, I think that's fair game. It's a really interesting subject, and there is, reason for concern there. But this like people act like this is some kind of defining issue. Like the phrase there, this will unite the parties. Why? If infrastructure couldn't, I mean, our bridges are crumbling. If healthcare couldn't, tens of thousands die. If the fentanyl epidemic.
I don't want to cut you off, but I would argue that this is just the beginning of some larger. This is a huge problem because it's going to be the end of women's sports. And I also look at what's happening in prisons. Look at what's happening in terms of where people are being housed in, say, hospitals. And women are now vulnerable to sexual assault as a result of this because people are self-identifying as
where's
women.
Where's the evidence of that happening?
Of the hospital. In the UK, there was a case of a woman who was on a women's ward and she reported a rape, and they said, oh, that didn't happen because there are only women on this ward. And then they went back and they actually found through security footage that there was actually a trans woman staying on the ward during that time. And so this woman had indeed been allegedly raped. And so I'm not saying that trans women are predators. Well, but this is something that we're seeing is much more is going to be much more common.
Well, with respect, absolutely not.
Not of trans women, but of men abusing the ability to identify as women.
This is fear mongering, and this is one of the issues that I take with you. You talk about science. I ask you, where's the evidence? You give me an anecdote. Where's the evidence of this?
What was the anecdote, though? This was reported in the news. This was reported in the news.
Rapes happen everywhere. One instance is not an evidence of a pattern. And by the way, England, up until recently, had a very prejudiced law where rape could only happen through penetration. Nothing else was counted rape. So if you're a man, you rape a woman, that can be counted. But there are cis women who have raped cis women in England, and it wasn't counted as rape because none of the available equipment was present. The idea
I believe I don't want to interrupt you, but I see we're coming so close on time, and there's so many things for us to talk about. So I just say that I think say with prisons especially, this is happening. It happened in England, it's happening in Scotland, it's happening in California.
I'll tell you this much. We don't have evidence that letting trans women into cis women's prisons will increase sexual assault. To my knowledge, there's no evidence of that upticking in an actual, here's a percentage, then here's a change percentage sense. We do know that trans women who go to men's prison are 9 times as likely to be raped. So purely from a harm reduction perspective, and this goes the same with the bathrooms and the hospitals and what have you, putting trans women in the same spaces as men is demonstrably dangerous, whereas putting them in the same spaces as women is circumstantially dangerous so far, only looking at given accounts or one specific bit or another.
But does that not matter that women's safety is being placed at risk as a result of that?
By putting trans women in men's prisons? I agree completely.
Why is it? But there's socially it's so unacceptable for women to speak up about this. If they say anything in favor of their own safety, they're deemed transphobic.
But there's literally no evidence at present of it compromising their safety, and there is evidence of it severely compromising the safety of the trans woman, who also
But
deserve
how
to
can you
not
say
be
there's no
raped.
evidence when there are women saying that this is happening to them? We see this happening in prisons.
I'm sorry, are
We
you
see
a
this
doctor?
happening
Wait, are you
in
a
terms
doctor?
of, I'm
That's
not
not
a
how you
medical
form
doctor.
a,
I'm
a,
not a
a
medical
PhD.
doctor, but I can do
No,
statistics.
no. That's not statistics. Evidence of news cases. I can find news cases of anything happening
There was
anywhere.
a
In
study
order to make
in
an
the
argument,
UK of
I'm
unisex,
familiar. Oh,
yeah,
sorry, please.
of unisex changing rooms and how this did actually increase. I have it in the end of gender. I can't think of the top of my head the statistic, but it did actually increase the sexual assaults.
But that's not trans women and women. That's men and women.
But the self-identification aspect opens the door. No, I'm not saying it's trans women who are doing this. I'm saying, but it's opening up the door to the possibility. And I'm totally there with you. I think we do need to have the evidence, right? There should be proper studies done. But how will those studies be done in this climate? Do you think that it would be even possible?
Easily.
Do you know how outraged people will be that you would even consider that gender self-identification may potentially lead to these outcomes?
It's not controversial to study these things in the sociological fields. There's often been a claim from, not to draw a comparison, race realists, people of the position that different races are of different inherent levels of intelligence, that the reason the scientists won't publish the studies, of course they do publish the studies, but this is the narrative, they won't publish the studies is because there's some sort of internal pressure against, like they can't do it. It's the PR is too bad. They won't be allowed to. In reality, sociologists do whatever the hell they want. It would be actually quite trivial to see whether or not instances of documented sexual assault increase significantly after the change of a policy. You could do it without even really tackling the trans. You wouldn't even have to introduce any discrete categories, only reports. But as of the moment, we're in a situation now where trans women, we know they're far more likely to be abused if they're placed in men's spaces. We don't know that there's an increase in harm predicated on them being put in women's spaces. And given that environment, to me, the idea that we should just ignore the evidence, ignore the science, and go like, oh well, keep trans women in men's spaces, it's just lunacy to me. I mean, why?
What about offenders who identify as male up until the point where they are arrested? Once they go into custody, they identify as female. So these are, say, sexual offenders who have raped women, who identify as female. They're going to be housed in a women's prison. And then we do see that some of these male-born rapists who are housed in women's prisons because they identify as female then go back to identifying as male once they are released into the community. And I for people listening, I mean, my audience knows this, but for people who may not be aware, I used to work with violent offenders and sexual offenders. So I do have experience working with forensic populations, and this is where my concern is coming from, because I know that these people are very antisocial and they will do whatever they have to do to get access to more victims. So does that lead to a pause in your mind in terms of, I agree with you, and I am concerned about trans women being housed in men's prisons and being at a greater risk of being violated. But I, at the same time, don't think it should be, okay, well, then we'll just, anyone who wants to go into the women's prisons or into women's spaces should be allowed to, without question.
I think it's an interesting hypothetical, but one which at the moment doesn't bear much statistical relevance. It's sort of like the, what about someone faking going into the restrooms or what have you? Though obviously this is a bit more significant because instead you'd be housed in a prison for some time. The question is, to what extent would a person be willing to do such a thing? People have pretty strong attachments to their gender identity. And, as a man, I can't imagine I'd be very comfortable in a women's prison. I mean, if you could cartoonify the whole thing.
More posh though for you.
It is, but it's also, it's not as though prisons for either sex are particularly accommodating. This is a hypothetical concern, which I think warrants real discussion. I do think there's a legitimate possibility of predation based on these preconceptions, but I have to go where the evidence follows, or where the evidence leads me, I suppose I have to follow. And at the moment, the greatest concern that we have actual evidentiary claims for is with regards to the safety of trans women. And if it does turn out there ends up being some significant issue of these fake, like rapes going up because of people fake identifying or whatever, then I think it would warrant examination. I imagine the easiest solution would just be to impose the same standards that people do for medical transition, which is that you have to live as your gender for a given length of time before they'll allow for stuff like bottom surgery. Meaning that if you're a rapist and you've been living as a woman for several years before being arrested, that seems like a fairly compelling bit of evidence right there that you might actually be a woman, unless you were anticipating being arrested and being sent to jail, years later after your court date finally comes up. Whereas if you just say, like, right on the spot, actually I'm a woman, maybe they would disregard that. I'd be interested to see how it plays out.
And your point about how sociological research could be done on this, I would say, okay, maybe in some disciplines in which there's an expectation as to what they will find with their findings, because I know this was another point that you brought up in the video you did. I do not think in this climate, there may be exceptions, but it is extremely difficult for objective researchers and scientists to even pursue questions that go against activism. It's next to impossible.
I don't think that.
What is that based on?
Well, I have a decent number of academic friends, and I'm only a bachelor's myself, which is hardly an academic, so I can't speak from personal experience. But oftentimes there's this weird conflation where it's like the researchers are beholden to the activists, but then somehow the activists are in agreement with almost every major medical institution in the United States. So it's actually the researchers who are the activists, in which case you think they wouldn't be beholden to anyone because they're acting ideologically in line with the group you'd expect to be pressured.
I don't want to cut you off. Is it possible that these organizations have also been influenced by the activists?
Influenced? Sure. But to the extent that it's compromised the validity of their research, no, I think that's conspiratorial. It's a long-standing conspiracy among homophobes that the only reason the APA removed homosexuality from the DSM was because of activist pressure. And that in reality, they all knew being gay is a mental illness, and they only took it off because of political pressure. In the absence of evidence, I can't say so. I think that the research on trans people, the sort of prevailing attitude, is consistent across disciplines for a reason, and it's because most of this stuff is borderline common sense. I don't think the activists hold much sway in what can or can't be researched.
What would you say to someone who's lost their job as a result of activists harassing them and putting pressure on their institution to fire the person?
Well, I know Libs of TikTok is doing plenty of that work right now. So if it was a victim of their thing, I would say I'm sorry for the harassment you've gotten.
Well, okay, but let's not make it an even across the board thing, right? What would you? It's serious. If someone loses their job because they're pursuing research that they are genuine, it's not hateful. They're just genuinely interested in wanting to know what the truth is, and they lose their job because they ask the question. Is that fair?
As a socialist, there are plenty of people in my ideological tradition who have legitimately lost their jobs due to the questions they felt worth asking. In my experience, and again, I understand this sounds...
And I agree with you across the board politically. I don't think it matters if someone's on the left or right. That shouldn't be happening.
I think it matters what they're being fired for. Them Lives of TikTok people, that's getting people fired just for being gay or trans or whatever, oftentimes. But
I disagree, but okay.
Well, I know. But with regards to the activism thing, 99% of the time when I see somebody in academia who is fired for the boldness of the research, they were academic with very strong formed political conceptions that were influencing their work, and they realized they could make more money being a social figure or a public advocate for their political positions than remaining within academia. Recently did this, an entirely unremarkable man in terms of his academic contributions. He got famous for lying about Bill C-16 in Canada, and since then has made his way as a self-help guru. And now, of course, he makes far more money doing that than he ever could acting as a professor. But when he was on his way out, he published a big article about how academia has left him behind and he wasn't allowed to do X or Y and blah, blah, blah. And to be honest, I don't really buy it. It's an origin myth, a creation story. Why are you out here spreading the gospel? Well, it's because academia couldn't handle the truth. Well, what was the truth? And then you look and, well, I think that sociologists and biologists have mostly free reign to determine what they're interested in looking at.
You can continue what you were saying here. I was hoping that this conversation was going to be cordial, but you can go ahead with the point you were making in my case. What were you going to say?
Oh, wait, am I speaking about, I'm not speaking about you. I was speaking, I'm
well,
not familiar.
After you finished talking about, I thought you were making a point about me. So if not, that's
fine.
Oh,
no, my apologies. I didn't mean to imply that. No, I'm not familiar with the work that you did. I know what you did. I'm not familiar with the actual research you've done. In my experience, it's very difficult to ascertain the sincerity of people's claims to that effect with regards to censorship or the effects of political activism, what have you. Now, does it happen? The question to this, or the answer is undeniably yes, it does. But I don't know if it happens along a line or through a pattern substantial enough to verify the conspiratorial belief that the output of these institutions must be weighted heavily and distorted by the effects of activism, if that makes any sense.
I mean, I disagree with you. I'm thinking of some of the points that you made in your video in terms of, I think there's this perception that for those of us who do go against the orthodoxy, and we talk about this, and people will say, well, look at the opportunities you're getting. How can you say you've been canceled or silenced because you're still getting these opportunities? In my case, getting to talk on the largest podcast in the world. But what goes on behind the scenes, people don't always see that. And I think people don't necessarily see how much harder some of us have to work in order to get those opportunities. Whereas if you were saying the right thing, you wouldn't be losing opportunities, or you would be getting more invitations to do things, or people would not be afraid to be associated with you. And so I would ask you and I would ask your audience to maybe consider that what you see may be the highlight reel of someone's career, right? But it's not necessarily what's going on behind the scenes. And also there are many things that have happened in my case that I don't talk about publicly just because I'm a private person. And I'm also someone who doesn't want to be seen as complaining, because I do feel very lucky to be in the position that I'm in. Go ahead.
It's not my intention to be dismissive with regards to that. I know people who've been legitimately fired for what I would consider unjustified grievances from academia. It's only that narrative, and the thing that I'm very cautious about is the idea that the product of academic institutions, of the research on the subject, is invalid because they silence internal dissent. And this is very non-falsifiable from a broad perspective because, of course, we don't actually know the specific reason most people get fired, right? I mean, a lot of it really is up to sort of you had to be there. It's not always easy to ascertain, especially as a non-expert. So when that narrative is constructed, it gives leeway to a lot of really bad subsequent ideas. In terms of where the research is at right now on the trans issue with regards to trans athletics or the sex differences or what have you, from whom I've spoken to, I do believe that the research is legitimately unclouded by political bias, because in addition to me having spoken with those people and having done a lot of research on race realism, because I argue with neo-Nazis pretty often, that researchers can go about in the modern day publishing like, well, here are the average IQs of different racial groups and not get canceled for it. I think more leeway is given than people think. If anything, the social media space is the one which curtails the greatest degree of fervent cancellation, because a lot of the stuff that goes by in academia just ignores public notice.
Well, I would say from my experience and the colleagues that I still talk to who are in academia, they tell me they cannot pursue this line of research unless it's very, very clear in advance what they're going to find, and that it's going to be something that's positive towards trans activism.
Well, what line? Like what if a study was to be done?
So you alluded earlier about, say, childhood transition. I know that's another area we disagree about. Any study that could potentially, that even looks at the question of what are the outcomes, and is it possible that childhood transition may not be beneficial for these kids, right? Because I'm sure I talk about this all the time, how all the research we currently have shows that most kids outgrow their feelings of gender dysphoria. So it makes sense to wait until they reach puberty if they want to make such a decision about transition. I fully support transitioning in adults if that's someone's choice. Do they what? Have to wait till puberty?
Well, the purpose of a pediatric psychiatrist with regards to gender issues would be to determine which cases of gender non-congruity are ones worthy of hormone blockers, right? I mean, I've seen the study that you're referring to, and it's not as though the sample of gender dysphoric children they were looking at were every kid who had been given puberty blockers. It was every kid who tripped a number of labels for gender non-congruence or discomfort, which is something that's pretty common when you're young. Kids are whatever, they're figuring out their identity. But I mean, it's not as though you just go over to the clinic as a 12-year-old and they just pop you a bottle of hormones, right? You go through rigorous pediatric psychiatric analysis, and then maybe you get on hormone blockers. And then of the people who get on hormone blockers, the overwhelming majority decide to go on and take actual hormones to transition later on, which is in large part, I think, because the pediatric psychiatrists do a pretty good job. If you're in there getting appointments for like a year and you're talking to an expert and you're like that grounded, even as a kid, on your identity just not matching your birth sex, that to me seems like it's indicative, if nothing else, at least maybe of the validity of puberty blockers.
I would argue that clinicians cannot do an objective assessment in this climate, especially when they, in Canada, say they potentially face up to 5 years in prison if they do not affirm. That really ties a clinician's hands in terms of what types of questions they can ask, and if they're going to be considered.
You mean
trying
they
to
can't do conversion
deny
therapy?
But the term conversion therapy, there's a difference between conversion therapy for sexual orientation and gender identity, right? Although I know that they're lumped in together. So conversion therapy for sexual orientation, I don't support, because you cannot change someone's sexual orientation. So someone who's gay or bisexual cannot be made to be straight. But when it comes to gender can change, especially in young children who are developing. So if all of the research shows
how so?
How 11 or 12 studies show that children with gender dysphoria, as they get older and reach puberty, they're more likely to outgrow those feelings. Then why
gender
would
dysphoria isn't the same as
block
identifying as the other
puberty?
gender?
Say that
Though
again?
it could, gender dysphoria isn't the same as identifying as the other gender, though it can. But what we're talking about when we say gender dysphoria, I believe the study was just looking for like incongruence, like a feeling of discomfort, dysphoria being a more pointed medical term. But with what they were talking
do you know
about in that study,
which study this was? Who are the maybe don't say the authors, but which?
I did read it. I don't remember the name of the authors, though. If I had to look it up in Google and look at the methodology. What I was looking at, though, it wasn't post-treatment. Like, these weren't children selected for puberty blockers, right? This was like a sort of pre-sampled list of children with feelings of gender incongruence.
And they did transition? Or was there, because the problem is with these studies, they also don't have a control group, right? So you don't know if there are any benefits. If the group of children who transition, they show benefits, you don't know if that's actually due to transition, because there isn't a control group of kids with gender dysphoria.
No, I think they
don't
didn't transition,
and that's what the problem is. They
well,
didn't transition. These are the desistants. You're talking about desistants.
Oh yeah. Thank you. Yeah, the desistance kids. Yeah. The issue I think that I have with this is that, like, that's the point. You say, like, in this environment, a pediatric psychiatrist can't evaluate this, but that comes across as conspiratorial to me, because this is, again, that nefarious political and academic bias prevents all these legitimate institutions and professionals from doing their work. It's like, it's non-falsifiable. There's the only real way to debunk that claim would be to read people's minds, and the only way to address it would be to change the political environment to one you consider more favorable. But I'm in favor of Canada's law. I don't think that it's the place of any psychiatrist, if a person, let's say a boy, goes up to them and says, like, hey, I think I might be a girl, for the doctor to go like, no, actually, I think you're not. I think you're a boy. I think that research on that has proven that to be a very ineffective way of dealing with any underlying issues. The best thing that you can do is affirm and try to get underneath it at any other concerns that might be present, and you try to understand the degree to which it's a sincere belief, as opposed to a sort of errant or flippant or otherwise unjustified self-perception.
But do you not think that children can have sincere beliefs and still be wrong? Because my concern is, if a child is blocking, if it's with puberty that they grow to be comfortable with their bodies, why would you block that process?
Well, first of all, I don't know how common it is for get puberty to make people more comfortable with their bodies, but
that's
in terms of
literature shows in these kids.
Well, the literature showed their feelings change, but not that puberty and the pubescent changes which took place were the things that alleviated their dysphoria. I think
there was a study that actually showed this, and the kids said, oh, with puberty, I grew comfortable in my body, and I realized I actually liked it.
Well, I may not have seen that. The earlier study with the desistance, I don't think specifically identified pubescent changes as the cause of those change in feelings, because it took place over a length of time. But with regards to that, it is possible for a child to be wrong, but like child self-diagnosis on mental issues is something that we have pre-existing care standards for. When a child has like depressive or psychosis, like there are like psychological things up with the kid, self-report. I mean, oftentimes it's the only thing that you can really do. But if you're getting these kids like appointments for years, and a professional is able to, bring together like a strong argument, like, yeah, I think this is actually like, and then you get on the puberty blockers and they're reversible, and you have some more time to feel however you want about yourself. And right now, the evidence that we have is the majority of people, overwhelming majority, who get on puberty blockers transition, and the overwhelming majority of people who transition are happy about it and don't regret it. So it seems like we're on a good track right now. If we get loose with our standards, and it's like kids are getting their hormone blocker Skittles like 2 weeks in or something, and it's just they're just firing it left and right, then that's yeah, I agree there should be a sort of strenuous vetting process, especially for children. But at the moment, it seems like the track is running quite well, and that people are benefiting from it, from the data that we have. But you would claim that they're not allowed to publish data that would make the results look bad. So see, it comes across kind of non-falsifiable. It's like, well, then how could I ever prove the validity of the process, right?
I can see that point. I think my perspective is different because, and I have to say, for many of the topics that we've been debating, I very much held your belief previously, and that's part of what made me want to write my book, because I thought I totally understand where people are coming from. And I'm definitely very sympathetic to these issues. Like for me, especially, I thought, well, it makes sense for a child if they have gender dysphoria. Why wouldn't you want to prevent them from having to undergo this process that's going to create them more distress? But then after I read these studies and I worked in the field, not with children, but just in sex research and doing research around gender and sexual orientation more broadly, realized that, oh, there's a side to this that is not being talked about publicly, or it's being shunned. And so I support transition in pubescent kids. If they do reach puberty and they're uncomfortable still, and that gender dysphoria persists, then I think that's their business, that's their family's business. And I don't think, it makes me uncomfortable when I don't think lawmakers should be getting really involved in that case. But right now in the climate that we're in, I see it as really, really difficult, if not impossible, for people to do this, make these assessments objectively. With regard to, I don't want to stay on this topic. We're already over time. So
my apologies.
No, that's okay. But I, with regard to you saying that blockers are, I think you said they're reversible. There has been research.
2 caveats to my knowledge.
Okay. Do you want to say what the caveats are?
Oh, sure. One is valid, one isn't. Bone density. I know that there can be a variance in bone density after puberty blockers, that starting on them later. Apparently, getting on the puberty blockers earlier actually lowers the reduction of bone density, which is counterintuitive, but there's a whole graph that I remember seeing on it. There could be some degree of variance. The other is of IQ, but that I think is a research error. Because the IQ variances that we have for the effects of puberty blockers were done on children who had prepubescent puberty, or what do they call it? Early onset puberty, which was research
precocious
done.
Puberty.
Precocious, thank you. Yeah, 80s and 90s, right? And what they found was that because they were going through precocious puberty, they were experiencing a sudden jump in brain development earlier than a lot of kids of their age, which led to them doing better on IQ test scores for their age. When they got on the treatments that mitigated the early puberty development, because that process slowed, their IQ leveled out as the IQ tests grew more difficult as they grew older, and they returned to the mean before eventually resuming. So it's not that their IQ dropped, it's that their abnormally fast increase abated as a product of but those are the 2 that I'm aware of. It's bone density and IQ, but the IQ thing I don't think is the concern.
And it's also not possible for us to say it's causation, because like I said, with these studies, they aren't randomly assigning the kids into treatment versus non-treatment, and there isn't a control group of kids with gender dysphoria who don't undergo the treatment. So any of these studies nowadays with kids with gender dysphoria, they're always going to be given the treatment because it's seen unethical to withhold treatment from them. So my point in saying that is that we can't say any of this is causal. But there was another study that showed in an animal model that spatial memory is affected. My concern with all this is just, I think, on the same page as you, I think research needs to be objective. There should not be any intimidation involved, any coercion. Researchers should not feel scared for their careers as a result. I know that you're skeptical as to whether that's the case, but from my perspective, that's where I'm coming from with this. And then the other point I wanted to make was with regard to detransition. So one of the young women I interviewed for my book, she said that she was able to access cross-sex hormones with one-hour appointment. And I do think the number of detransitioners is growing. My sense is you would disagree with that.
I think the number is going to grow because the number of trans people is going to grow for sure. That had to be an adult, right? There's no way 1 hour appointment for like a kid. That would have had to be an adult, correct?
I can't remember her age. I think it's in my book. I think she was, I don't know if I want to say, you go.
Oh yeah, yeah. You don't have to specify. I was just curious because I know at least here in the U.S. the protocol is very strict in a lot of respects for like the referring of this to the other. I know they can do it in 16 in the UK because that's their age majority, which it's weird because 16-year-olds are babies, but yeah.
I believe in your country because I'm Canadian. It can be 15 in some states.
I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know you were Canadian. I mean, I'd have to look into the it could be the medical age of consent. I know the medical age of consent is different from the age majority. Whatever the case may be, with regards to detransition, detransitioning is relatively rare. The data that we have on the effects of cross-sex hormones and surgery is quite positive from everything that I've seen. It doesn't mean detransitioning is not something to be looked at. It's worth noting that from the studies I've seen, the majority of people who are detransitioning are doing so not because they're not the identity they transitioned into, but because of social or medical barriers preventing them. I believe there's a breakdown. I think this one's actually on Wikipedia, where one of the a study was done, and it was something like 80 to 90% of the people detransitioning who listed why it was because lack of support, medical barriers, not enough money, which is heartbreaking. That being said, there are going to be people who I guess we would call it like a proper detransition, like they're like, oh wait, no, never mind, fully back. And I think those people should be afforded the exact same degree of medical and social care and support as I would for trans people, or as anyone else should for trans people, because that's got to be incredibly difficult too. It is a very strenuous process, at least for young people at the moment, to transition. I think that it's a decision that should not be made lightly, but invariably with anything like this, there are going to be people calling takesies backsies. And I think that, that's unfortunate. It's also inevitable, and we should do everything we can to make those people's lives good, the detransitioners.
And I agree with you that if someone is detransitioning because they can't access care, or if it's because of stigma, I don't think that's good. And I think that we should be more compassionate and supportive in that case. But if you look at the research that has been published on detransitioners, many of them will say it's because they had internalized homophobia. So many of them, say for the individuals born female, are lesbian, and they're not comfortable with the fact that they're attracted to women. So they wanted to transition to male because they felt that'd be more socially acceptable to be a man who is sexually interested in women. Or it's because of sexual trauma. So as, again, women having experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault and not feeling comfortable with their bodies, or being dissociated from their bodies and wanting to escape that.
Is this that Abigail Shrier thing? What was that one book?
Abigail Shrier's book?
Was it Shrier?
Well, I don't want to speak for Abigail. I do talk about this research in my book as well. It's Lisa Littman's research. And it shows that there are, in terms of rapid onset gender dysphoria, the reasons why young women are so quickly gravitating to this label of wanting to be transgender or non-binary and living as men, only to change their mind event later. Once there comes, I think, a greater understanding or self-acceptance of whatever the underlying reason for them wanting to take on that identity was, which is not to say that trans men don't exist or that trans people don't exist, of course. And I'm also, I try to be very mindful and responsible when I talk about this, because I do recognize that there are some people who will say, well, because some people change their mind and detransition, then why should we let anybody transition at all? But I don't agree with that. I do think it's important, though, to talk about what's happening right now with this in terms of this population, because they are making some decisions that may not ultimately be good for them. It's tearing families apart. The parents, this is another area that you might be skeptical of, but I hear from so many parents who are saying they can't talk to their kids. Their kids are essentially, being protected by the state. They cannot, don't have any say in terms of their care. And for a parent, I mean, that's terrifying, I'm sure.
I totally get that. I do want to say, though, with regards to a counterpoint, is that Littman's research is utterly without integrity and shouldn't be trusted. The term rapid onset gender dysphoria came from a study where Littman did a question survey of moms who frequented websites oriented around parents of trans children who didn't like the fact that their children were trans. A psychiatric evaluation into a group being done by polling their disapproving parents is like the bad joke version of how you would do a sociological study. I think that the fact that that study got published, and worse, peer reviewed, is like actually a bigger strike against legitimacy of academia than anything else I've ever heard, including that James Lindsay, let's publish those so-and-so fake sociological articles to prove how bad the discipline is. Oh God. The idea.
For the record, I thought James's investigation was brilliant, but we disagree on that, and I'll talk about Lisa's work as well. But go ahead.
I think he's a loon, and he's been running for me, but I'll get him one of these days. With regards to the Littman stuff, this isn't a study even worth considering. It's a psychiatric evaluation by polling disapproving parents. You might as well get like an evaluation on race and IQ by polling like white, Southern, what are they called, country club members. It's just meaningless in terms of like where these.
Can I make a point about the parents before you move to your next point?
Sure, but you have to recognize, of course, that a psychiatric evaluation done by polling disapproving parents is a ridiculous way to conduct. Like, so the parents say that it was because of internalized homophobia. How could you possibly? I mean, sure, they could say that, perhaps, but of what relevance is that to actual scientific inquiry?
But I don't think it's fair to label these parents as transphobic, because many of them would say they didn't care whether their child was trans or not. They didn't care about the outcome. And many of them were in the study, it says that they were very much in favor of equal rights for gay people and for gay marriage. And many of them, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but were self-identified as Democrats. So these are not parents who are anti-trans.
This is indefensible research. The researcher Littman literally went out of their way looking for websites which are opposed in some way to trans. They always say this, right? It's like, well, I was a Democrat. A lot of these people are TERFs. A lot of these people were.
Okay, well, I would say TERF is a slur, but
TERF is absolutely not a slur. It's not a discriminatory characteristic. It's only a smear against a person's political affiliation, which, I mean, you might as well say Nazi is a slur if we're going down that road. I mean, I do mean it with all negativity intended, but not a slur. Nothing against women. There are TERF men that I've talked to, and they're fun too. Anyway, no,
I don't know why that label is necessary. I feel like we can have the discussion without having to insult people.
It's what they are. I could call them transphobes, which they also are, which I would also intend
an
with
insult,
negativity.
right?
Well, right. Well, you can't say TERF is a slur. Yeah, it's an insult, sure, but I find their positions insulting. They exist in a manner which I think hurts marginalized people. You wouldn't take issue with somebody being called racist if they were a racist, right?
But racist is more of a descriptive term, whereas transphobic, or I feel like any disagreement with this narrative gets you labeled as something disparaging. I don't think
this
race.
is also what racists say when you impose the narrative of racial equality on them. I mean, that's what everyone says, right? It's like, well, you're insulting me by accusing me of being bigoted, and I'm not bigoted. I'm only disagreeing with this new trend. Well, that's what every bigoted
But
group
this
says.
goes to my point earlier of, is it possible to be critical of trans ideology without, does that necessarily mean that you hate trans people?
No, you can be critical. I argue with trans people all the time on my platform. There are plenty of.
But that's why I disagree with calling things transphobic, because to me, when you call something transphobic, no, I think it exists, but I think many things that are not coming from a place of hating trans people are being lumped in as being hateful.
So it's not about hate. Bigotry doesn't have to be about hate. There are plenty of people who don't hate Black people who are nonetheless racist. But if you take a look at, so right now, the site Trans Critical Professors or Professionals is private. But on Transgender Trend and Fourth Wave Now, you'll see plenty of things. Hate is certainly one of them, but that's not the predominant trend. The most you're going to see is a sort of contemptuous, paternalistic disapproval of the effect that trans ideology is having on the youth. But again, a psychiatric profile being done of trans people by polling their parents who disapprove of them being trans is wholly unworthy research. The opinions of those moms are worth literally less than nothing. I mean, it would be, again, like a profile on interracial marriage done by disapproving white fathers from suburbs in the 1960s. It's like,
I don't feel like these comparisons to race are apt, though, because the concerns about gender, there are, like in this case, this is a legitimate, not to me, this is a legitimate study. Lisa Littman should have been allowed to ask this question. There's this phenomenon of people transitioning very quickly out of the blue, no previous history of gender dysphoria. Why is that not a legitimate question to ask? And
Debra,
how is that considered similar to racism?
Conduct a psychological profile on a minority group by polling their disapproving parents. This is matter of factly ridiculous. If it was,
but she doesn't. She's not saying this is a psychological profile. I believe I don't want to speak for her, but I believe in the paper she acknowledges that this is not a clinical diagnosis. She's just doing a descriptive study, which is very typical.
It's a descriptive study on the psychological profile of these children's vis-a-vis their parents' report. That's where you just pulled the internalized homophobia thing, which I think is bunk,
that was a second study. That was not that study. That was a second study.
Oh, they both pull it then. It's a common narrative that I disagree with, though. The idea, like the idea that a person wants to avoid the stigma of being gay, so they transition. I'm sure it's happened. Actually, funnily enough, in Iran, the state will actually subsidize transition because it seems they're okay with trans people, but they're not okay with homosexuality. So if you're a homosexual man, they'll have you can transition to a woman and you can have a heterosexual relationship. It's not exactly ideal, but it's just an interesting tidbit that would sort of play out in that way.
So, but what would make our culture different? What would make North America different?
We stigmatize trans people more than we do gay people, in a great many ways. Do you think
in this moment that's still true, though?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Also, it's way easier to be gay than to be trans. I'm gay. I'm not trans. Being gay is as easy as which bars you go. It's not even that. I'm being facetious, but you can, the gay lifestyle, if anyone wants to call it that, that's easy peasy. You can drop in and out. Transitioning, oh my God, it's expensive and time consuming, and you lose a bunch of your friends if they're not on board. The idea that people would do this flippantly, don't get me wrong, it happens, I'm sure. Take a large enough group of people and eventually somebody's going to do something like that. But is there like a statistical concern of people doing it flippantly to avoid the internalized feelings of shame they have over their homosexuality? From what I've seen, that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems, at the very least, counterintuitive to me. I mean, you would acknowledge that being trans is a lot harder than being gay, wouldn't you?
I think it is definitely much more of a, in terms of the process of transition, yes. I'm someone who grew up in the gay community. I'm straight, but I have had so many of my friends say to me that if they were growing up now, they think they would have transitioned to female as gay men.
Well, I mean, a lot of people, J.K. Rowling said that. I feel like a lot of people project their personal, biases onto that. until it bears out in existing research, I suppose we'll have to see. I mean, some
But
of the
it
people
is
who
in the
said that to you might be
detransition
closeted.
in that study that I said. These girls are transitioning because they're not comfortable with being lesbian. They say that.
I would need to take a look at that study then. That one specifically I haven't seen, but I'd be
I can
interested.
send it. I'll send it to you.
Okay, I'd be delighted. Thank you. You know, barring my evaluation of that particular study, uh, whatever data we do have, and again, I can't speak to the idea that some data is not being published or investigated thoroughly enough because it might procure bad results. But from the data we have, detransition isn't common. And when it happens, it's usually because of social stigma or medical barriers. Um, at the end of the day, when we're talking about the existence of detransitioning people, we're just going to have to accept that their existence is an inevitable complement to the existence of people who medically transition. There's no way to have a medical procedure undertaken by so many people without some people looking to undo it in some fashion. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take an effort to minimize the number of people who unduly transition or to be supportive of detransitioners. It only means that I wish that their experiences wouldn't be sort of weaponized in a campaign to raise concerns over the extent to which we gatekeep people right now from transitioning. Most people agree, at least in the trans community, the gatekeeping as it stands is too significant. So it seems like, if anything, we need to go in the opposite direction.
I agree that I don't think the issue of detransitioning should be weaponized against trans people. I don't agree with that. But I think it goes back to the point I made earlier about clinicians feeling like they can't do their jobs properly. But I want to just let you have a chance to say, is there anything that you wanted to bring up? Because I know that we're over on time right now.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Oh goodness, well, we are. Time flies when you're having fun. Well, I took a snipe at James Lindsay earlier, of course, which, hardly my first. I saw some of your conversation with him.
Yeah,
And
he was on, just for people listening, he was on episodes 39 and 40. He was also on my podcast earlier on talking about different subjects, but more recently we're talking about political grooming and sexual grooming in schools.
yeah, that. Speaking of a lack of evidence, from what I say, and to your credit, by the way, you say this, in that conversation, but comprehensive sex education improves the lives of young people in basically every way, like in terms of use of contraception, lower pregnancy rates when you're young. And from the research that exists, which isn't much, unfortunately, but from what does exist, programs like that significantly reduce the amount of pedophilic predation against young people. You point this out too. It's much easier to call out stuff like that if you know broadly what's happening. In ignorance, predation reigns. But when young people have terminology they can use to describe what's happened to them or whatever, grim stuff like that. But the weaponization of these terms, I mean, you say political grooming. I have no idea what that means in terms of actual grooming, like the actual proper term for it. There's just no evidence of this being in any way correlated to like woke, like elementary school teachers or whatever. It's just another like big fear mongering bit. But I guess if you acknowledge that these comprehensive sex education programs are wholly beneficial, what's the concern?
So I'm trying to think how to best summarize this because I don't want to speak for James. I have to say that conversation definitely changed my perspective on many of how I feel about this issue, because as a former sex researcher, I've always been very much in favor of sex education. I think it's very important. And like you said, comprehensive sex education, I've always publicly been a big defender of it. But after talking to James, I've realized that what is being taught in the classroom today is not reflective of these programs that were previously helpful to kids. And like you said, helping them have just proper names for their anatomy so that kids are able to protect themselves and they can acknowledge or identify when abuse is happening so they can report it. But now it's started to work in these ideas that are nonsensical and are a way of separating children from their parents in terms of the way they see the world. They have these particular views about sexuality and gender. And it's a way of like pretty much everything we've talked about in this conversation, things like gender fluidity, that children can be let's not talk about boys and girls, because if you are a little girl, you may not really be a little girl. I mean, that the possibility that a child is going to grow up to be a transgender adult is so statistically small. And I just don't think it's appropriate to be talking to kids about this stuff, because it's very confusing for young children. I think if it's being taught to kindergartners, yes. I think up until even I would say even close to puberty. I mean, kids, their conception of gender is so malleable, developmentally speaking. It's just not, it makes me question. I mean, do you wonder why would a teacher feel that this is so important to teach a child? And if they are, so I don't really want to get too much into Florida's parental rights bill, but the outrage around that. Pardon?
Just the Don't Say Gay bill. Yeah, I was making sure that I had the same one.
Right, that's what it's being called by some people, but
it does prevent you from talking about sexuality, of which gay is one. Yeah.
Right, but no, but it's about teachers teaching this in their curriculum for kids, kindergarten to grade 3, and for precluding parents from those discussions. That's what the bill is. You can say gay. There's nothing about this thing. There's nothing about saying gay. You can say gay all you want. It's about specifically teaching kids these ideas. So why are these educators so upset that they can't do that?
So
why is that so important?
Well, first of all, the Don't Say Gay bill is borderline unconstitutional. It's restriction of First Amendment educational rights. So I feel like this isn't really just like a woke left thing. Like, there's a reason the entire Democratic Party has condemned it as well. It's not particularly. It's not just. So first of all, it prohibits in curriculum, the instruction of anything pertaining to sexuality or gender. But there isn't a very strong legal definition for curriculum as opposed to just classroom discussion. And from the way the Libs of TikTok Twitter account and all of its subsidiaries are acting, it seems like just bringing up the existence of gay or trans people constitutes political grooming to a lot of these types. And then you have the fact that
I just want to say for Libs of TikTok, because I know that you've mentioned them a couple times in this conversation, that I don't want to speak for them. I know. I don't want to speak for them because I don't know them, and I don't know what their intentions are. So I think it's just fair to say that much, right? We don't know. We can't really attribute motive to them because we don't know.
Well, we know they're a far-right political operative whose goal seems to be to paint a bunch of trans and gay and gender non-conforming people who work in education as groomers. In spite of, for the vast majority of the people they outline, of course, there's no actual evidence of any grooming taking place. It seems like a very cheap and cynical politicization of the word, personally. Anyway, to speak to the broader point here, the issue that if
you're teaching kids nonsensical ideas about gender and sexuality with the goal of making them woke, is that not a form? It may not be sexual grooming, but is that not political grooming?
There's no such thing as political grooming. Political perspectives inform our biases everywhere we go at all times, and they have in education forever. There's no such thing as political grooming.
I don't think it's been in education forever. I don't think all teachers have always been political and always imposing their politics on kids with the goal of turning those children in the same direction that they're in.
With respect, that's a very ahistorical perspective. The curriculum of the United States, the educational curriculum, has always been informed by people who are making a deliberate effort to instill certain values, whether it be patriotism, whether it be subservience to the state, whether the curriculum be oriented around making people good factory workers or service workers. There's always been a political bias, and the political or progressive inclinations of the time have always had an influence as well. Obviously, people were getting these same accusations back in the 1960s. And likewise, you were getting a lot of this back in the 1920s as well with the suffragette movement, when there were political activists who also happened to work as educators. There was this renewed fear-mongering about them being, they're trying to indoctrinate young boys to be submissive to females or whatever nonsense they would say back then.
But do you not think there are some teachers who would go into teaching saying, my politics, it's not my place to put my politics on my students? Is that not an admirable way to go about teaching? If your students don't know what your political, but I don't think it should matter about someone's politics. I think regardless of left or right, you shouldn't be imposing those. If those aren't your children,
racial equality.
But that's not is that a political value?
That is absolutely a political position. Yeah, 100%. See, this is the problem that I have. you say you claim you don't like politics and X or Y, but you only label politics the current zeitgeist, the current culture war discourse, and everything prior to that, all the battles that have been fought and won in centuries past, those aren't politics anymore. It's just accepted. That's not true. Racial equality was, they literally had to send the National Guard in to protect the Little Rock Nine when they were being integrated in what was it, Alabama? This was just 2 generations ago. We are not far off from the idea of racial equality being taught in class being a legitimately politically subversive idea.
I feel we should have another discussion about the topic of race, because that's a whole other thing, and we are over time right now. But I appreciate
I'm sorry.
I appreciate you with your perspectives, and there's so much more I think that we could obviously talk about. But do you want to share any final thoughts with my audience before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I guess yeah, to cap off that point, I guess I just want to say that like where we invest our energy is very important. And as any person interested in sort of scientific and rational consistency, would adhere to, you need to follow where the data goes. And right now, the data of there being some grooming epidemic in schools, well, hold on, that's actually a problem, but it has nothing to do with woke anything. That's just a problem with teachers. The 2 big places where child grooming happens is in the home and in the church, but Republicans want to focus on the school, and coincidentally only on the
Do you think it's happening in the school at all? Would you acknowledge it's happening at all?
Of course, but actually child sexual predation has been going down over time as wokeness levels rise. I just don't think there's a correlation. I don't think that
I'd need to see that study.
in terms of sexual predation over time. Oh yeah, it used to be way more common than it is now.
With wokeness? Well, I can tell if you were being facetious.
I just mean that like progressivism, we've only gotten more progressive with time on social issues here in the States, but the amount of child predation that's been reported has been going down ever since we started tracking stuff like that. And I think the mid 20th century, like the reported instances of child abuse have gone down and down and down, in large part because our society is more integrated with the internet. People have easier access to info that can let them know if abuse is taking place. Stuff like Me Too, it sounds silly, but it does actually get people sort of invested in the mindset that they should report if abuse is happening, and that's good. The less child abuse is happening, the better, But I strongly disagree with this cynical weaponization of the term grooming. Grooming is a serious thing to do, and it's being applied to like teachers. I feel
it's no different from Nazis. Dances. But go ahead. I don't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
Well, if they were calling all these teachers Nazis, I would disagree with that too. But like, there are people getting called groomer. Some teacher lost his job because he said, like, to any trans kids who were rejected by your parents, "I love you." The idea of a teacher saying, "I love my students."
I think he said, like, "I'm your parent now," right? Isn't that the same guy?
Oh yeah. The idea that that's
appropriate.
I don't think there's anything remotely inappropriate.
Do you understand?
About that.
Could you see why parents might be uncomfortable at that?
I don't
this
care.
This is one specific case. So I'm saying more broad. This is one case we're talking about, but I think is indicative of something larger that's happening.
The comfort of the parents is not a determining factor in the validity of an educational protocol. If we defer to that, then we'd have Christian fundamentalists suing every school district in America every time evolution is brought up. I mean, we've been down this road, right? Parents have a right to determine the education of their children when they're at home. When they're at a public school, it is up to the institution of the public school. And I think that's a fair and fine thing. Because, regardless of, how many TikToks of woke teachers or whatever, for the most part, public education, it does a consistent. I can't say good because American education sucks. So I keep trying to say good, but it's not. It does a bad, but nonetheless consistent job of instilling, very certain educational premises. The idea that everyone's walking out of public education being some sort of woke bot is not true. If you actually care about your students, or your kids being woke, you want to get them off the internet. The internet is full of access points to very progressive spaces. You could just isolate them and like homeschool them, I guess. But the world is getting more progressive. I think this is a good thing that should be celebrated, even if it leads sometimes to cringy teachers doing like TikTok dances while talking about how they're teaching their second grade students how the gender binary is fake. Like, okay, like, do I think that's like appropriate for second graders? I don't know if inappropriate is the word I use. More like stupid. I just don't know if there's a point. For me, it should be like, if you're talking with kids, it's like, oh yeah, sometimes people are straight, sometimes they're not. Oh yeah, sometimes people are they're born as boys, they stay boys, sometimes they stay
But that's
girls,
the problem
whatever.
because it's teaching kids now, like we see the lawsuits that are happening, right? Where there are kids, there are girls who are transitioning behind their parents' back. The parents don't know. And in some cases, these kids are attempting suicide and the parents were completely kept out of the equation. So that to me is where my
Wait, how's
concern
that
is coming
lawsuit?
from.
Wait, what does that have to do? Who's being sued there?
The school boards are being sued
What do they do if the
because
kids are
the
transitioning?
teachers were withheld the information from the parents, and in some cases this is where to me the grooming aspect comes in. They were the ones coaching the kids to take on these identities. Anyway, if you want to come back on another time, I'll have you back on. Happy to do
Sure,
that.
yeah, I'm sorry. We keep running over. My
We're
apologies. I
coming
just
up
have to
to
ask
how
though.
many 2 hours, I
Last
think.
thing,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
last thing. I swear to God, no. Would you say the same thing if like a kid disclosed they were gay, like they had homophobic parents, and they told a teacher like, "Hey, I think I'm gay, but I can't tell my parents because my parents beat the shit out of me," and the teacher's like, "Oh, that's okay. You live your life, you know." And then later that kid like attempted suicide because of social pressure, and the school district got sued by the parents. Like, do you think that'd be a legit lawsuit? Like, is that grooming or is that just?
So I've thought about that, and I think in that case, the teacher who's being told that the child is in an abusive situation should report that to the authorities. I don't think it should be the teachers. I don't think it's appropriate for the teacher to be the one keeping secrets from with the child in any or having a special relationship with the child. That to me is a huge red flag. Whether or not someone has the intention of it being a sexual relationship, it could become a step down that way, or it could maybe not. But I just don't think it's appropriate for people in positions of power to be having secrets with children. Do you
But
agree?
well, not really. I mean, when I was in school, you know, I didn't even know I was gay back then. But like, good teachers can be like another like calming authority figure in your life. You spend a whole year with them when you're young, and if there's like advice they have, you know, don't get me wrong, the secret relationship is kind of a loaded term. Like we're talking a wide range here. If a kid discloses something, you know, if there's no avenue to report to the police abuse, I mean, if you report it to the police, then what? Like they show up at the house and it gets made public and the kid gets beaten within an inch of their life after the police find that there's nothing they can officially charge the parents with because there's no evidence for like, yeah, I don't know.
Well,
Like
I
it
mean,
seems
but
like that'd
that's
be a
an
lot of way to get
extreme.
people hurt.
That's an extreme. I think it should at least be. I mean, if you want to talk about what should be done in that case, I just don't think there are situations, and I think most adults who are put in that position probably would be uncomfortable to say, I don't feel right that a child's telling me something and I have to keep this a secret. They should want to at least, I think, put if they are concerned about the child's well-being, to put some sort of precautionary measures into
Sometimes
place,
just having
right?
a person to disclose to can be hugely beneficial for the suicidality of queer youth, you know, like the feeling they don't have to keep it hidden from absolutely everyone if they know they have a supportive teacher. I just don't think that leads to groom, like parents will
I
groom
just
their
think there's a
kids
potential
too,
there
so
for it
it's
to be abused, right? There is a potential there for it to be abused
true.
if
But
we're
any
normalizing
standard,
the secrets between teachers and kids from
well, any
keeping it from their
standard
parents.
where any relationship between like people in a position of power and children can be harmful would include parents, right? I mean, parents, I'm
True.
pretty sure the household's the number one grooming central, grooming station, you know, 8 lines on that union station. So it just seems like a sort of weird imbalance, especially since the only thing this is getting focused on is queer issues. Like it at the end of the day, look, if a kid is transitioning or like thinks they're a boy or a girl, you know, whatever, and they don't feel comfortable telling their parents, the abuser, as far as I'm concerned, is the parents. Any environment in which a child can't even voice concerns like that or like questions or interests with their parents, talk it out, is one in which that, as far as I'm concerned, that child's already being abused. The teacher being disclosed to in that case is just probably a modicum of relief for the student that they don't have to hide everything from everyone. But I'll take a look at the details of the lawsuit. It just seems to me like a lot of this is misdirected anger at trans people trying to be weaponized against institutions that can be sued because you can't sue every trans kid. Um, any,
There have been multiple lawsuits. Can I just say before we say goodbye, I just ask for people listening who may not be familiar with my work to please read The End of Gender. You can get it free on Audible. The audiobook is read by me so that you know what my positions are. I feel that much of the criticism I get is people who have not read my book, have not read my work. It's based on things that other people have said about me, which in many cases are not true or are not accurate reflections of my opinions on these issues. So I just ask that. And I really thank you for coming on my podcast. I feel like there's something more you want to say.
there's always something more I want to say. Don't tell me that. Don't give me permission. I appreciate you having me on. Seriously, it's been a good time. Sorry for running over.
That's all right. All right. Well, thank you so much. So we talked about, I'm going to be releasing this in a few days, and all right. Take care.
Take care. Have a wonderful time. A wonderful day. Jeez. Have a good
You
one.
too. Bye.
Bye.